What is up, guys? Welcome to episode 9 of the Past Your Prime podcast. My name is Alex. I'm a professional volleyball player and have enormous calves. This is Craig. He's a physical therapist. Say something, Craig.
I'm Craig.
Perfect. Today we will be exploring the exercise standard and the basics of programming. Before that, we'll jump into injury updates with Alex and Craig.
How's your injury?
My wrist is worse than it was last week. Who did that?
I actually made his wrist a little worse during a physical therapy session, but in my defense, it was a coterie with Sarah, my wife, who's also a physical therapist, and I would like to blame her, but it was absolutely me. Your extension was almost normal, though.
It was.
Full extension.
And we also got a diagnosis out of it.
Yeah.
So
So
somewhat worth it. But
for me, it was totally worth it because first, I didn't experience the pain. Number two, it's always good.
I experienced the pain. Okay, just making
You experience a pain.
Yeah.
I was actually very excited by the session because you almost got full extension. The pain generator is very clearly not the bone, which is what we were most concerned about. It appears to be mostly tendon, no tenosynovium. It's kind of exciting, actually. And you were also able to set the ball. Pass ball? You were also able to ball.
I was able to volley.
Oh, is that what you call that?
No.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
All right. Nobody knows what volleyball terms are here.
Well, the regular one here does.
Oh, you do know.
You-
I don't. I misunderstand. Okay.
All of it. But I bought a weighted volleyball, and so I've been setting with the weighted volleyball to try and work on that extension.
And it looked really good.
You have no clue what good setting looks like, but nonetheless.
I only cared that he was able to do it without him blowing his wrist up.
Thank
And
you.
then what actually we ended up figuring out is during a mobilization on his wrist, that's when I blew up the extensor pulsus longus, which is the clear pain generator, which is really interesting that's actually the part that's hurting you.
Right. And it's like a tendinopathy.
It's a tendinopathy. And this is one of the parts that I always find interesting during the rehab process. You'll have clear injury that happens, and then during the course of the rehab, you can either have secondary pathologies develop, or you have one that was always there and then became more and more present, or a misdiagnosis. This one, I don't think, obviously it wasn't a misdiagnosis. You had a fracture in your scaphoid at one point, but how long has that been there? And also, was there a tenosynovium? Because it was extremely clear in the session today. And then what type of weird mechanics is happening that's causing you to overload that tendon? To me, it doesn't make sense, but that's what actually, that kind of gray area where you have to stay on your toes and you have to monitor for what somebody's response is in session. For me, it was actually a huge win. I got to cause Alex some pain, but number two, we also less risk at its bone and really big progression.
Generally speaking, tendinopathy is like an overuse thing, and I feel like it kind of started to feel whatever pain that was once I started kind of hitting more mobility exercises. So, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
kind of what it seems like.
Cool.
But it is weird. Isn't it interesting that it mimicks the pain you had originally? Doesn't it actually?
Kind of. Well,
Or is it
yeah, that's what is odd about this whole thing is that when I broke it, I really didn't have any pain. I mean, I kept playing 2 more matches. It hurt, but it just felt like a sprained wrist or something like that. And so I feel like this pain was different. And once again, I just started experiencing it when I really started pushing extension. So maybe the tendon just got weak from lack of use, blah, blah, blah. So what about your injury? Your neck?
My neck is much better. I keep on falling off of doing the things that actually make it feel better. So last time I wasn't actually able to turn my head whatsoever without pain. I was doing the robot look over at you. Thoracic mobility work basically completely knocks it out. I have no issue with it today. I have to be consistent with my home plan now for the next month or two. Otherwise, I believe it'll come right back. But it's dramatically better. I have no neck pain right now.
Thoracic mobility being upper back.
Upper back.
Yes.
Yep. Great. You have 3 levels in your spine. You have your cervical spine, thoracic spine, lumbar spine. They're obviously all connected. Each of them have different architecture, which leads to different types of motion. The thoracic spine is very prone to becoming immobile, and it will drive uncontrolled irritation through the neck and the low back if you don't keep it mobile.
Nice. Alrighty. So on to today's topic, the exercise standard. So we've got three standards of exercise: rehab standard, which I am very clearly in based on the last episode. Feel free to give that one a watch to see the first standard. Today we're jumping into the next standard in that progression, which is the exercise standard, which kind of comes with the basics of programming an exercise routine.
Yes. It's where programming becomes very useful, very useful. And I do, the rehab standard also has programming in it. It's just the use of it is it's very different in that at any one time you basically abandon the programming because your tissue becomes irritated if you overload your tissue capacity.
So that's from like the therapeutic lens and the rehab standard. So what is programming for the exercise standard look like?
Okay. So with the exercise standard, we just actually shot a mini podcast on what causes people to not be successful with exercise, and especially in the exercise standard. And I believe that's what programming in this phase should really address. Number one, the skills of showing up. Number two, overcoming exercise barriers. And then number three, just the basics of a program that allow you to get the benefits to fundamental movement and the basic strength increases, endurance increases, speed and coordination that allow you to be a functional human being.
I'm interested in kind of sports specific training kind of versus general training. So can you kind of break down the differences between just general training and sports specific training? We talked about this a little bit before recording this morning, and I think we both had some kind of unique perspectives on it.
Yeah. So general training to me are things that target the basic aspects of fitness, your cardiovascular system, your ability for your muscles to produce strength, the ability to do normal functional movement that you're going to use in a day-to-day routine, and also the movements you're going to do in the gym. Now, in my opinion, that is dramatically underused by strength coaches and by coaches in general who are trying to get athletes to perform at a high level. I believe that most of the improvements in skill and your ability to play at a higher level with sport happens when you're actually doing the sport. I think that's way more important. And I think general training should actually focus on developing that foundation. Sport specific training is going after the variables that should increase your ability to perform when you're out on the court or when you're doing whatever event it is that you actually want to be able to do.
Right.
The only other piece I would add on to that is sport specific training should also target the main issues and injuries and problems that you see in that sport, which that's actually where you were talking about.
Yeah, because so originally I thought Craig's kind of viewpoint on this was that sports specific training is kind of unnecessary. And my argument to that was like, okay, well, you're a baseball player, you're a volleyball player, you do some sort of, high intensity sport. You need shoulder exercises probably more so than a runner's going to need. They're probably not doing anything to make them move their arm faster.
I mean, it's a great point. Where I think that already gets captured, though, at least in our system, is in the rehab standard. So I think it's more predictive to know your own injury history than to know the typical injuries in a sport. Even if the most common injury in volleyball is like major injury is an ACL tear. Have you ever had an ACL tear?
No.
I could totally see that being something that, hey, we want to do jump training and make sure that your knees aren't going to valgus because that's been linked with higher rates of ACL tears. Okay. But your biggest issue is going to be your wrist and it's going to be your shoulder. And so if I was building out a plan for him, I would have already addressed his shoulder home plan in phase 3, where we talk about the rehab standard. And then we can refine it in phase 4 in this exercise standard. And then when we get to the performance standard, it's already just a foundational piece of how he's going to be working out. But we'll also want to make sure that we're constantly monitoring that his shoulder and his wrist are tolerating these progressive overloads that are going to be happening in this program.
I kind of partially disagree. I'm not an expert, but if you've never been injured, would you still consider that as a part of a rehab standard to, say, work on your shoulder for baseball, volleyball?
So one of the more common terms out here is called prehab. you're almost going after those types of problems. I think that that's a great idea. If you don't have a tissue capacity issue, I don't think you need to be in the rehab standard. And this is a good point. If you're a coach out there and you're programming for volleyball players, or if you have a group of runners, it would be idiotic not to do the things that would make somebody more durable during activity. I'm not disagreeing with that at all, and I also believe that is a piece of sport specific training, is to make it so that the stimulus that happens in the actual activity that matters to you is really well tolerated. I do think a lot of that should get covered in a really well developed general program, like we're talking about today with the exercise standard.
Right.
And if you own functional movements, if you own those 6 functional movements, there's still going to be things that are like specialized movements that need to get stronger, need to be better adapted to, or at least you need to make sure that your body's tolerating those new loads. I think that's absolutely a good argument, and something that makes total sense to me, especially when you get to the performance standard.
And I think you can see performance improvements just by doing your activity. I think that's something that we also came back to this morning, was just go play more volleyball. I saw large increases from not playing volleyball for about a year during COVID, and then just going back to playing consistently 3 to 4 times a week. I mean, my vertical jumped up, I got stronger, I wasn't having any shoulder pain. And so a lot of that can be covered by just doing your activity. If it's running, probably running more will help with that. I'm not an avid runner by any means, but
And I think the biggest thing is to always consider what the biggest issue is at hand. If you're currently injured, it's your tissue capacity. If it's that you're in the exercise standard, it's making sure you're showing up. And then the number 3 is if you really are going to try to maximize your performance, what's the performance variable that has the biggest impact on that sport for you? So what position are you on the volleyball?
I am an outside
All in their field.
or a wing spiker. I like to call it a wing spiker,
Wing spike.
but outside hitter for the regular folks.
What performance variables tend to separate people apart in that position?
Part of it is skill specific. So you've got to be really good at passing and receiving, but you really have to be one of the most well-rounded players on the court. You've got to be able to pass and receive. You've got to be able to block. You've got to be able to serve. You've got to be able to attack. So you kind of have to be able to do everything. And that's why having a very well-rounded program, probably why I like so much variability in my programming, is because you've got to be able to do it all. You've got to be fast. You've got to be able to move on the court. You've got to be able to jump high. You've got to be strong, be able to attack.
I love that. For me, the most important thing then is he has to be a well-rounded athlete. I believe that's the same thing that most human beings on planet Earth would benefit from, and that's what we hit in the exercise standard. So if you don't have a problem showing up, and you know how to put yourself on the calendar, I'm sorry, I'm gonna hit that like a dead horse. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
I'm gonna beat a dead horse to death.
Just stop beating the horse. Leave the horse alone.
My wife is gonna now not listen to this podcast after saying that.
We love animals.
We love animals. But seriously, it's the biggest issue is that if you fall off of your workouts, it doesn't matter how well we program, you have to actually do the workouts. The second thing is understand your own exercise barriers, are the things that make you not actually exercise. You can go back and look at times that you've taken long periods of time off over a week or 2 weeks of not exercising and figure out why the heck you quit. We're not going to talk about that today. We're talking about the third part, which is training smarter, not harder. That's a general program that every person can do. That's owning the 6 functional movements, and that's improving your capability in strength, endurance, coordination, and speed. A well-rounded program will hit some aspects of all of those.
Yeah, I'm just realizing from taking just time off plyometrics that some of my coordination speed is just off, and my nervous system is just not used to that, just from, taking a little break, 4 weeks off from plyometrics. The next would be, what exercises do you kind of always include in your more general program?
I always include some level, and we've hit these before, 6 functional movements, some level of a lower extremity press, which would be like a squat, a lower extremity pull, which would be like a pull through or a deadlift, a split leg exercise like a reverse lunge or split squat, upper extremity press, which could be a push up or a dumbbell bench press, upper extremity pull, which would be a lat pull down, pull up, or a row, and then core. Those 6 exercises you can do with minimal to no equipment, which allows you to implement this almost everywhere. And it's a foundation for every movement that you do in sport, in life. Basically, it's all over the place. and now, like I said, obviously there's no specific exercise for spiking a volleyball. That's a specialized skill. Same thing with throwing a baseball. Those are specialized skills that need to be developed actually in the sport that you're doing. But if you're not using all of those movements, what I think ends up happening, you get stuck on machines, for example, where you can't actually do the movement unless the machine is guiding you to coordinate it. So one of my biggest issues with machines is you lose coordination. Great, you're building muscular strength, but you can't do a squat without something on your back.
Yeah.
Right? Or
the weights are all going to fall off the side because you don't have the balance.
Yeah, and that's an aspect of coordination. And I do believe that in primarily machine-based workouts, you lose a component of coordination. And that coordination piece is such a critical aspect to being a functioning human being that I don't think we give it enough importance in our workout development. And then from there, it's just what exercise you hit on what day. So there's a good match. How do you balance recovery, fatigue, and the actual stimulus or the stress from the lifts? That's what you do in a single workout. And then how do you link those together? That's programming.
Nice. There's an article on the pastureprime.com website that has those functional movements on there. And by the time that this podcast drops, we'll have video examples of kind of the basics of those movements. So you guys feel free to check those out there. I know we've gotten a couple of questions in the podcast about those functional movements and what do they look like. We don't want to drop them in the video because it'll take too long, but check out pastureprime.com in the article section, and you'll be able to see some of those functional movements.
You'll see them all.
Are there common exercises that people tend to get wrong or do them ineffectively or potentially give themselves a little bit higher risk of hurting themselves?
People do all 6 of those wrong. And it's actually really interesting how often those basic movements, and that's why, like, if you master those 6 movements, you can do anything in the gym, right? It's the base piece of it. So for example, if I want to teach somebody how to do a clean, I teach them how to deadlift first. If I want to teach somebody how to do a push press, I have to teach them a shoulder press or a vertical press first. There's all of these are building blocks to further movement development. If you don't own those 6, you're gonna continue to fall into issues. So for example, the most common one that people do poorly is squatting. I mean, by far, squatting and hinging, which would be a lower extremity deadlift, like a deadlift. They're movements that are, I think you showed me a video of your daughter squatting once.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful. It was a textbook squat, but we lose that sometime. At some point, we quit doing the movement and we become incredibly uncoordinated.
I was telling you this morning that sometimes just coming up from a deep squat, my knee is just like yelling at me and cracking and crepitus. Yeah. Very crepitus. I don't know if that's the correct way to use that word, but
probably I've heard your knees. Yeah. A lot of crepitus.
Yeah. So, and for your daily activities, it just helps so much to be able to do these movements. Obviously, if you're loading them, you're getting stronger and it's just going to make it easier. I mean, I've got a 50-pound 5-year-old and I want to be able to pick her up from anywhere. And my wrist was limiting me before. It's strong enough now and I can pick her up and throw her. And it just, being able to have fun with your kids, and it just makes a big difference.
Functional movement, right? It's so the whole idea that what machines do is they limit the degree of freedom. So you're able to apply the force in a direction that it's telling you to go. It's a great tool to have. I'm not saying that you can't have your entire workout based on it, but I do see that there are limits to your ability to use it in your day-to-day activity. And if that's not one of your goals, okay, totally fine. Like I have no issue with it. My people who are more into like looking for like a bodybuilding routine, machines can be super useful for doing that, especially if you're trying to get into range positions that wouldn't be safe with a typical free weight setup. Not a big deal. But I'm very much biased more towards functional fitness, just because from a day-to-day standpoint, every day where I see somebody has that base, they're easier to rehab, and it's easier for them to adapt and develop an exercise habit, which are, to me, the 2 biggest issues that people face.
And those would generally be more compound exercises.
They can be single joint. So for example, say with squatting, one of the issues is your quad's not strong enough. You may want to do something like a quad set, which is where you basically are sitting down and you just squeeze your quad, which turns it on. Where you're sitting and you do a longer quad where you extend your knee, which would look similar to like a lower extremity, a leg extension.
That's what I was going to say,
right?
leg extension. Yeah.
That you can do targeted stuff that's still functional because it's addressing whatever the thing that's limiting the movement. So it's really common as you age, as you do activity, you lose some of these movements because you're not forced to do them, right? If you're not engaged in sport or if you're not engaged in an active lifestyle, you can get through the day without doing much to your body at all. And so to me, that is a humongous issue. And the longer you go without doing it, the more you lose it.
Yeah. I mean, my watch tells me, like, you've been inactive for 10 minutes. You should do something now. I find myself just sitting at home and like, okay, I've sat on the couch for 30 minutes now. I've got a bike at home. Like, let me just go ride the bike for 30 minutes to make me feel like I'm getting some activity in. And I mean, I'm sure it makes a big difference. It's, small term goals, but long-term benefits.
Long-term benefits. I just got some news right before we started this today that somebody I care about had a fall and was unable to stand up for days. And so, it's very pertinent. I was given a talk to a group in Tucson last week. And during the course of it, I asked the crowd, how many of them felt comfortable going down to the ground and standing up. Not a single person raised their hand.
That's scary.
And these were individuals between the ages of, 50 to 70, but they were all doing physical exercise and physical activity. So I do want to add in, you should also, along with those 6 functional movements, you should be able to go up and down from the ground.
I feel very comfortable doing that with 200 plus pounds on my back.
Boom.
Yeah. So,
but it's a big one. So it's super important because, time will continue to pass. And if you're not working on it, you'll lose it. You'll lose the ability to do it. It's not going to just stay there. Your body is very efficient at taking away everything you work hard on.
Well, we just talked about load a little bit. So let's kind of switch lanes a little bit to progressive overload. I think there obviously are like bodybuilding benefits to progressive overload. I feel like that's where we hear about it the most often. But for athletes or folks that are, just working out in general for general fitness, I think there's large benefits to it. I don't know what question to ask about it generally, but like, how does progressive overload have an effect on, your overall training and fitness goals?
Well, so progressive overload is an interesting concept because if you really think about it over the long term, eventually you're not going to be able to continue to progress, right? At the start of exercising, you can take advantage of our body's natural ability to adapt. So first what happens is you get this nervous system change. So your muscles that you already have start to contract more efficiently. So you'll start to see an increase in load that it can handle. And then you'll start to see things like muscle tissue will develop and it can start to handle more load. And then slower, your connective tissue and your bone will start to develop so you can handle more load. So progressive overload, the whole concept is that you continue to apply more stress so that your body adapts to it. Eventually, it'll hit a level where you really can't do it anymore. And that's the concept of periodization or block training, where you start to provide different stimulus at different times so that you can target for one period, primarily strength, another period, primarily endurance or speed or coordination, because there's going to be different reasons why when you kind of hit the top level of what you can hit, why you can't keep going on. And that's, to me, that's kind of the beautiful part about programming is it allows you to say, okay, I want to get more fit. I want to develop an exercise habit. Okay, what can I do for this program for this period of time to make sure this person shows up? The biggest mistake at the beginning part would be making the workouts too complex with movements they can't do. That means that you'd have to rely 100% on motivation to be able to actually do your workout. And you can see how that would suck, right?
Right.
That'd be a horrible plan.
And I feel like I've just struggled with it because I want so much variability in my workouts where I want to work on all 4 of those principles at the same time. And I know in my mind that it's not the most effective, but I feel like, okay, if I'm only working on strength for 8 weeks, I'm going to lose all my athleticism or coordination or speed. And that's not necessarily true because you can probably weave them in a little bit. But really having those focuses, at least if you're training to be, an athlete or an aging athlete that's past their prime, um, you really need to be very focused on what you're working on in each of those blocks, whether it's 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks at a time, and then you'll see the most performance gains.
Well, and in general, after you get past that level where you can do the movements, you know how to show up and you're actually doing the workouts consistently, within 5 to 10 weeks, you're going to feel dramatically different with your workouts. And then at that point, you can actually start to pick some of the variables that you want to work on. In our place at Smith Performance Center, one of the biggest pieces is just general strength training. You can, with almost minimal variation, you can build strength for years using very simple programming tools. And then along with that, you can start to do things like, okay, let me throw in some aerobic endurance training workouts, right? So I can start to do, 30 minutes of walking that then I progress to uphill walking that then I progress to running. You can do these things that then start to progress your ability to do the endurance work. And you can even coincide at the same time with the strength training. So especially when you're in this first phase of general strength training, you're going to be able to have gains, and all of those variables are going to start to improve.
Right.
You're going to get coordination from doing these functional movements. You're going to develop greater endurance and strength, which will then allow you to really take your lifting and the exercise you're doing to the next level. So in those phases, then what ends up happening, which I find the biggest issue, is you don't actually take recovery periods. So you don't actually get the benefit from the stimulus that you're doing. You actually drive yourself into the ground because you laid your fatigue so high that you just feel like garbage.
And you're not adapting your body's not adapting the way that you want it to for your programming. You're just beating yourself to the ground.
You're just beating yourself to the ground.
Yeah.
And I think actually a close problem to that is not working in what the daily stimulus or the daily grind that your body actually also has to go through, where, you're stressed from work. You have kids who are, taking up time, and obviously they should take up some of your time,
Yeah.
right? Not in a bad way, but that they, you may have some fatigue around that, and you may have a hard work day where you have to do all of this stuff that basically grinds on your body. We don't recognize that as an additional stimulus to the body, along with the workouts that you're trying to do.
And we've talked about it in the past, but I found now more recently that the days where I'm sitting at a desk more often, my workouts are not as good in the late afternoon when I generally have time to go to the gym. Comparatively, when I try to stand at my desk, I go for a walk or something like that at the office and just keep myself a little bit more active during the day, then I'm able to hit at least my lower body exercises way harder in the evening when I work out.
Really?
Yeah.
Makes me wonder if you're having some level it's priming you for the workouts.
I think maybe just keeping loose. And I feel like for my hip, that's one thing that kind of got me started with wanting to stand up at the office more often. And then, taking walks during the day. I think there's just a lot of general benefits to getting sunlight and going outside and seeing the sun and
100%.
touching the grass, etc.
Being a healthy human.
Right. Yeah. And those, I don't know, my body is more ready for the workout at the end of the day comparatively to the days where I'm sitting at my desk.
See, when I hear something like that, there could be a psychological factor, but there could also be some priming component. There could be that when you're sitting, there's something that's inhibitory towards your leg muscles. Any of those things could be happening. That's the power of paying attention to your own body and just realizing that everything that we're saying here, and I know that we're using a lot of generalities to start with, because that's where you have to start. But when you start to do this more often, you're going to catch that there's things that are individual to you that make you successful. Ultimately, be pragmatic and use the tool, do the things that are actually useful to you. For me, for example, if I have any of the stuff on my leg, like the nervy stuff on my leg, I can't work out. So I don't enjoy it. It makes my symptoms dramatically worse. So I manage it very well throughout the day. But if I start to develop those symptoms, I know that lifting will make it dramatically worse. So I never let that happen, and I can target in other ways. That took me years to develop the tool set or the skill set to be able to manage my injury. But before I had that skill set, I basically was I was the person recurrent injury hell, which is a horrible place to be. So when you find tools like that, the way that you just said, don't make sure that you add that to your normal routine and make that into your typical program.
Yeah, it just makes me think of, I've heard of, like servers at a restaurant that maybe on the other side, they stand a weird way the whole day when they're, waiting in between tables, and that's causing them problems during the day. I find that when I am sitting down, I tend to sit with my legs extended out. And I think that was giving me more calf problems because it was putting more pressure on my calf, just the way that I was sitting. And so just kind of trying to be mindful about those things that are a part of your normal daily habits and routines that you may not even know, they feel fine in the moment, but, 6 hours later when you're at the gym, they could be having a negative impact on your performance or your routine. So I feel like we jumped off track a little bit there.
But. No, actually, it's a good one. I actually, so this was a conversation I've had recently multiple times where individuals will feel that their workouts are causing them to be more exhausted than what they feel like they should. And in almost every case, what we found is that they had a large variation in their day-to-day activity. So they had days that were high intensity days relative to work. And it could be mental as much as physical.
Right.
And then they had days that were kind of in between, like mid, and they had days that were low. And what was happening is their high days, they weren't recovering well from those high days. And sometimes they'd stack a workout on top of that day, and they would feel that they couldn't work out the rest of the week. So for them, the big piece was realizing, okay, I have to do my workouts on days that are not my high intensity days. That seems obvious, but it's really not obvious because it's just because you don't really think of your work days. You get used to them being hard, right? Specifically, one of these individuals is a nurse, and it was really interesting to hear how they knew that it was hard, but they didn't realize the impact it was having on their body. All those pieces that are important, you need to incorporate that into the programming thought process.
Just on the soreness part of it, you were talking about the kind of mental aspect of it, and I had a pretty mentally draining week. I would say it was pretty stressful overall, and I think that drove me to work out harder in the gym. But I also find, I was telling Craig this morning, my legs are just super sore. I mean, I increased load a little bit, but not anything 20, 30%. I just went up by a little bit. Really tried to stick to the plan pretty well this week, and I'm just way more sore, and I'm wondering if it was just because of the mental stress that I had this week, and it very well could be.
It could be, and that would be, so this would be one of the things that we'll use this as an example. Now, with Alex, he's already mentioned multiple times that he actually does not mind being sore, and that it's been something that
I actually enjoy it.
He actually enjoys it, right? Yeah. So you may not be like that. And it's actually really important that you know if that's not something good for you. And what I would do is, if you, in the last 2 years, this is how our place does it, you look through and you see periods of a week or 2 weeks where you've stopped exercising. If one of them happened because you got so sore that you didn't want to go back to doing the activity, that's a barrier to you showing up. Don't work out to where you're that level of soreness. That's my biggest concern, because being super sore for a good portion of people it can be scary, but it can also make it so that you don't come back to the gym. And it's just a mistake. It's a mistake you don't have to make.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Let's switch gears a little bit and just talk about kind of volume and intensity based on your goals. So you've got a lot of people have strength goals. Hypertrophy is one that I hear a lot of people talk about. Maybe you can jump into that a little bit. It could be, endurance or power training. How does, how you're building your sets and reps work into some of those categories?
And how does it work into the programming?
Yeah.
All right. So sets are, say we're going back to your row, and during your rowing with the band, you have 3 sets programmed for, let's go 10 reps. That's the most common scheme that you'll see, is 3 sets of 10. If we're trying to go for strength, you're going to drop it down to, between the 5 to 8 rep range. And then if we're going to go for endurance, we're looking more like 10 plus range. Now, if we're going to go for speed, it's going to be a tempo, or there's some level of trying to do rapid force development. Okay. So when we talk about programming those, we can use those in different ways across multiple workouts so that you get a direct stimulus to the body tissue that we want to hammer. Now let's say, for example, you want to do strength. The hardest part with strength is getting comfortable lifting the weight, right? Most people, when they first lift, it's actually not going to be limited by how much they actually can lift. It's going to be so uncoordinated with the movements, they can't do it. And then
No, I was just saying, like, from getting back into squatting, I mean, I've probably only been back squatting for maybe 4 to 6 weeks max now. And yeah, I mean, at first, I was using a machine to be able to squat probably over 300 pounds. But now that I'm back under the barbell, I did 275 yesterday, and it wasn't hard, but it just felt like, okay, like I've got to kind of put all of the coordination together again to be able to actually move the weight up and down with good form and not hurt myself, etc. And so,
yeah.
yeah, it's just difficult to come back to or even learn for the first time.
So it's like that comfortability with the load can sometimes actually be the biggest limiter. So if we're talking about strength, what I always find interesting is how often the issue that people will run into is they don't feel comfortable with the weight that they would actually need to be doing to have the change in their strength. And nothing against the ladies, but it's way more common in women. If women tend to have, and I'm not sure if there's where this gets pushed, but almost like a cultural belief that lifting weight's going to cause them to balloon up. Like there's a kind of an aesthetic component to it, or I'm not sure where it developed, but almost a fear of there being a large negative change to how they look around the amount of weight that they lift, or that they're going to hurt something. So that's what's interesting on that is the stimulus for increasing the strength. The biggest limiter in this situation is just getting comfortable with the weight, right? So
that's where the foundational
exercises.
Yeah.
And so our team actually uses, when somebody comes in, we do an intro program, and the intro program is actually more targeting the movement. And so you can do things like linear periodization, which is where as the intensity goes up, the volume goes down, right? And so you basically invert it. And what that does for you is as the reps go down, you're going to increase more weight. You'll get a strength increase from it, right? And then if we talk about going for endurance, you would see the higher the reps go, the lower the weight's going to be. And you're going to feel fairly terrible, because I find those sets to be the worst ones, where you're going to hit 12 to 15 reps at a
I was just going to say that
number.
I was just going to say the same thing, that like 3 to 8 reps is my wheelhouse, and I probably need to get outside of that wheelhouse a little bit. But yeah, I hate doing high amount of reps.
Well, so there's
just dislike it.
So
totally.
So obviously that's what we're going to need to start doing for him to make him even more sore. But the strength piece, I think, is always the easiest place to start. And so we have all these things where people will say this is exactly the set rep scheme for getting stronger. With some of these, it's actually getting used to the discomfort of the physical activity. And I find that to be really undervalued. And when you're beginning, or say you're coming back to it, that's the piece that is always interesting to see how people get more and more comfortable with it. But in general, it's like, 5 to 8 reps for strength, 10 plus for endurance, when we're looking at like strength endurance. And then for coordination, it's really just groove those patterns.
Right. Yeah. Like I said, put me anywhere over 8 reps, and I'm highly unlikely to do it at that point. I feel like has gone over the years of training with you. Whenever those come up, I'm like, I'll just stop at 8.
Yeah, nobody cares. Nobody cares. Nobody's judging me.
Right.
That's actually one of those pieces where if I want somebody to get really high on a lift, I really like to do things like a triphasic type program, where you'll work on really slowing down the descent during the activity. We call it like the eccentric phase.
Yeah.
Or owning the isometric phase. Those things are really fun, because you can get like a huge strength increase just by mastering the coordination of the muscle contractions. So there's all these like tricks. Like if I want somebody to max out, I'm going to practice some of those things, and you can sharpen your ability to actually produce greater contractions.
Yeah.
And you can do it. You can have large jumps in your actual 1 rep maxes from it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Kind of in closing, we talked about this a couple of times over the past few weeks, but how has your approach to programming changed over time. You know, you've been a physical therapist for 10 years. You were a personal trainer, strength coach prior to that. And I feel like in terms of physical therapy, you were kind of bragging about how much better you over
Oh no.
over 10 years.
No.
That's okay. It's
Yeah.
confidence is a good thing. But yeah, how do you think your approach to programming has changed with your experience?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. My first experience was as a personal trainer and then as a strength coach. And then I did cardiac rehab. And then coming into having, a couple gyms, working with a few thousand different people. I think the biggest piece is clarity on what the actual problem is and how often people don't actually understand what their main problem is. They may have a sense of it, but it's hard to articulate. And how often people will think they need to have some level of sport specific programming when the actual problem is you feel terrible. If you hurt, this needs to be addressed first. And then with exercise, it's typically people fall off. Most people, like we talked about, like the National Quitters Day, most people don't develop the skill that actually helps them show up. Nobody has the same problem and nobody has the same answer, but there are some general problems that help you to get really specific on what your real problem is. I think that's a part that I love about it.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll close it out there. Thank you guys for tapping into episode 9. Drop a comment below if you have any questions. Jump over to pastureprime.com. We'll have some of those articles updated with some of the basic fundamental exercises with some videos on how to do those. Like, comment, subscribe, share. We'll see you next week for the next episode.
BYB, baby.